"Hands up!" That's what police screamed as they kicked in a black man's door in an illegal raid. They stormed inside with guns raised, treating him like a criminal in his own home. But this wasn't just any man, this was Judge Leonard Carter, a federal judge who had spent decades upholding the law. And when their flashlights hit the wall, they froze, staring at his judge's robe hanging in plain sight. What began as a night of terror would unravel into a scandal of lies, cover-ups, and a fight for justice that reached the highest levels of power. If this could happen to a federal judge, what chance did anyone else have? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The lamp on Judge Leonard Carter's side table cast a warm glow across his living room, illuminating stacks of legal documents spread across his coffee table. His reading glasses perched low on his nose as he studied a particularly complex case file. Years of experience had taught him to look for the subtle details others might miss. Leonard's fingers traced the edge of a particularly troubling affidavit. The case involved allegations of police misconduct, something he'd seen far too often in his 60 years. Growing up in the segregated South had given him a unique perspective on justice, or rather, the lack of it. He'd witnessed firsthand how the law could be twisted to serve the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. A car passed by outside, its headlights briefly sweeping across his walls. Leonard barely noticed, absorbed in his reading. His fingers tapped thoughtfully against the arm of his chair as he considered the implications of the testimony he was reviewing. Years of experience had taught him to look beyond the words on the page to see the human stories they represented. The security system's small green light blinked steadily in the corner, a constant reminder of the precautions he'd taken after years of handling sensitive cases. The cameras were discreet, but thorough in their coverage. Leonard had insisted on the best system available, knowing that a federal judge could never be too careful. He reached for his tea again, grimacing slightly when he found it cold. Standing up, he stretched his arms above his head, feeling the strain of sitting too long. His bones creaked a bit. 60 years left their mark, no matter how well you took care of yourself. The stack of papers on the coffee table seemed to mock him with their remaining thickness. Leonard's bare feet were silent on the hardwood floor as he gathered his empty mug. Maybe a fresh cup of tea would help him finish this last section. He carefully placed his reading glasses on top of the open file, marking his place. The grandfather clock chimed softly, marking the quarter hour. As he stood, his gaze swept across his living room, the comfortable space he'd created for himself, filled with memories and meaning. The moonlight filtering through the windows cast soft shadows across the floor. Everything was peaceful, orderly, just as he liked it. He had just taken a step toward the hallway when the world exploded into chaos. The front door burst inward with a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the entire house. Splinters of wood flew through the air like deadly missiles. The sound was deafening in the previous silence, a violent intrusion that shattered the peace of his home. The door's destruction brought a wave of chaos as armed officers poured into Leonard's living room. Their Navy tactical gear seemed to absorb the lamplight, making them look like dark specters invading his peaceful space. Flashlight beams cut through the settling dust, dancing wildly across his walls. "Get down! Get down now!" The lead officer's voice boomed through the room. Before Leonard could process what was happening, rough hands grabbed his shoulders. His body slammed against the hardwood floor, knocking the wind from his lungs. The impact sent papers from his coffee table flying, scattering like leaves in a storm. "Stop resisting!" another officer shouted, though Leonard hadn't moved a muscle. A knee pressed into his back, grinding him against the floor. The pressure made it hard to breathe, and the cold wood pressed against his cheek. "Where are the drugs?" a harsh voice demanded. "We know you're dealing out of this house." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and infuriating. Leonard could smell the officer's coffee breath as the man leaned down close to his face. "I am not." Leonard started to speak, his voice calm despite the situation, but a rough hand pushed his face harder against the floor. "Shut up! Nobody gave you permission to talk." The officer's words dripped with contempt. Leonard felt the cold metal of handcuffs pressing against his wrists. More officers stormed through his house, their boots thundering on his floors. The sound of drawers being yanked open and contents dumped echoed from other rooms. Pictures crashed to the floor, and someone knocked over his grandmother's antique vase. The shattering sound made Leonard wince. It had been in his family for generations. "Look at this place," one officer sneered, kicking aside Leonard's legal documents. "Probably laundering money, too. These thugs think they're so smart." Leonard's chest tightened with controlled rage, but his face remained composed. Years of maintaining judicial composure served him well now. He focused on his breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, just as he did during tense moments in his courtroom. "Check upstairs," the lead officer barked. "Find his stash." More boots thundered up Leonard's stairs, and he could hear his bedroom being torn apart. The sounds of destruction continued. Drawers dumping, closets being ransacked, furniture being roughly shoved aside. "Bet you thought you were real clever," an officer taunted, circling Leonard like a predator. "Nice house in a good neighborhood. Perfect cover for your operation." He kicked aside more of Leonard's case files, sending them skidding across the floor. Leonard remained silent, his mind racing. He knew his rights, knew every law these men were breaking. His security cameras were capturing everything. Each violation added to the growing list in his head. Illegal entry, excessive force, destruction of property, civil rights violations. "Nothing in the kitchen," an officer called from another room. The sound of his cabinet doors slamming echoed through the house. "Keep searching," the lead officer ordered. "These dealers always have a hiding spot." He turned back to Leonard, voice dripping with disdain. "Where's your stash, old man? Make it easier on yourself." Leonard's glasses lay crooked on his face, digging uncomfortably into his nose. The knee in his back pressed harder, making him grimace. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing him complain. "Check behind the pictures," someone suggested. "Behind the baseboards, too. These people get creative." More crashes followed as frames were ripped from walls. Leonard thought of the family photos, the art he'd collected over years of travel, the memories being destroyed by these men who'd invaded his home. "Hey, what's this?" An officer grabbed a leather-bound book from Leonard's shelf. "Probably where he keeps his records." He threw it down in disgust when he realized it was a legal volume. The lead officer paced impatiently, his boots leaving scuff marks on Leonard's polished floors. "Something's not right here. This place is too clean." He kicked Leonard's tea mug, sending it rolling across the floor, leaving a trail of cold tea. "Maybe he got tipped off," another suggested, rifling through Leonard's mail. "Got rid of everything before we arrived." Leonard could feel the growing frustration in the room as their search yielded nothing illegal. The officers' movements became more aggressive, their destruction more pronounced. They were angry at finding nothing to justify their invasion. "Get him up," the lead officer finally ordered. "We'll make him talk at the station." Two officers grabbed Leonard's arms roughly, starting to haul him to his feet. One officer raised his baton, preparing to emphasize their threat with force. But as he drew back his arm, his eyes caught something on the wall behind Leonard. The officer's arm froze mid-swing, his face draining of color. The other officers followed his gaze. One by one, they fell silent, their grips loosening on Leonard's arms. There, hanging perfectly straight on the wall, was a pristine black judicial robe. Its stark black fabric contrasted sharply with the crisp white collar, both illuminated by Leonard's reading lamp. The federal judge's seal was clearly visible, a silent testament to Leonard's authority. The room grew deathly quiet. The only sound was the settling of debris from their destructive search and the steady ticking of Leonard's grandfather clock. Each officer stood frozen, the reality of their massive mistake slowly sinking in. The silence shattered as the lead officer's radio crackled, making several of them jump. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, fumbling to shut off the noise. The harsh, fluorescent beams of their flashlights lowered one by one, like guilty children avoiding a parent's gaze. "Stand! Stand down!" the lead officer stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Lower your weapons. Now!" The last word came out as a desperate hiss. The officers holding Leonard's arms released him as if his skin had suddenly become scorching hot. Leonard rose slowly, deliberately, brushing dust from his beige t-shirt. His movements were measured and calm, though his wrists ached from the handcuffs. He stood straight, his full height and dignity restored, facing the men who had invaded his home. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," the lead officer managed, sweat now visible on his forehead under the harsh light. His eyes kept darting between Leonard and the judicial Robe, as if hoping one of them might disappear. "Remove these handcuffs," Leonard said quietly. His voice carried the same authority it held in his courtroom, though he hadn't raised it at all. The effect was immediate. One officer practically tripped over himself to comply, hands shaking as he worked the key. The handcuffs clicked open, and Leonard rubbed his wrists slowly, examining the red marks they'd left behind. Papers from his case files still littered the floor around his feet, and the spilled tea had begun soaking into one corner of his Persian rug. "Your Honor, we had information that—" the lead officer started, but Leonard raised one hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Before you continue," Leonard said, his words precise and measured, "you should know that everything that has occurred here tonight has been recorded." He gestured to the small, discreet security cameras mounted in the corners of his ceiling. Their tiny red lights blinked steadily, like patient eyes watching the scene unfold. The officers' faces paled further as they followed his gesture, noticing the cameras for the first time. Some shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering their actions and words from moments before. The one who had kicked Leonard's tea mug took an unconscious step backward, nearly tripping over the scattered legal volumes. "The footage is automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server," Leonard continued, straightening his glasses. "Every moment, every word, every action." He let each phrase land with deliberate weight. The lead officer's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "Your Honor, if we could just explain—" "You forced entry into my home without announcing yourselves," Leonard interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. "You used excessive force against an unarmed citizen. You destroyed my property." He paused, looking around at the chaos they'd created. "And you did all this without showing me a warrant." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the officers' radios seemed to hold their breath. Through the broken doorway, a cool night breeze stirred the scattered papers at their feet. We had information about suspicious activity." The lead officer tried again, his words trailing off under Leonard's steady gaze. "What was the address on your warrant?" Leonard asked simply. The officers exchanged nervous glances. The lead officer's hand moved to his pocket, then dropped away empty. His face had gone from pale to ashen. "There must have been a mix-up with the addresses," another officer offered weakly. "A clerical error, maybe?" Leonard said nothing, just continued to look at them with the same penetrating stare that had made countless witnesses squirm in his courtroom. The silence stretched out, broken only by the steady ticking of his grandfather clock and the crunch of broken glass under nervous feet. We need to," the lead officer stammered, starting to back away. His men followed his lead, edging toward the splintered doorway. Their earlier aggression had vanished completely, replaced by an almost comical desire to escape. "Wrong address," one muttered, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Definitely wrong address." "A terrible mistake," another added, voice barely audible. They retreated through the broken door frame one by one, backing away as if afraid to turn their backs. Their flashlight beams bounced erratically across the walls as they moved, creating a chaotic dance of light and shadow. The lead officer was the last to leave, pausing briefly at the threshold. "Your Honor, he began, but whatever excuse he'd planned died on his lips under Leonard's unwavering gaze. He turned and hurried after his men, their boots crunching on the wooden splinters that now littered Leonard's front porch. Leonard stood motionless in his ravaged living room, listening to their hasty retreat. Their footsteps faded into the night, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting. Soon, the only sound was the gentle whisper of the night breeze through his broken door and the continuing steady tick of his grandfather clock. He remained where he was, surrounded by the debris of their invasion. Scattered papers, broken glass, upturned furniture. Behind him, his judge's robe hung undisturbed on the wall, its presence as quietly powerful now as it had been during the raid. The white collar seemed to glow in the dim light, a symbol of justice that had saved him from who knows what fate. Through the jagged opening where his front door had been, Leonard could see the empty street beyond. The police cars were gone, leaving no trace of their violent intrusion except for the destruction they'd left behind. He stood alone amid the chaos, his robe a silent witness to everything that had transpired. The morning sun filtered through Leonard's hastily patched front door, casting strange shadows across his kitchen table. He sat there in his crisp charcoal suit, his fingers drumming softly on the polished wood as he waited for someone at the precinct to pick up. This was his fourth attempt to reach the police chief. "Police Department, how may I direct your call?" A bored voice finally answered. "This is Federal Judge Leonard Carter. I need to speak with Chief Matthews immediately regarding an incident at my home last night." His voice was firm but controlled, just as it had been during the raid. "One moment, please." The line clicked to hold music. Leonard straightened his red tie and glanced at his watch. 8:15 a.m. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night documenting everything while it was fresh in his mind. The security footage had already been backed up to 3 different locations. 5 minutes passed. 10. The hold music droned on. "I apologize, Your Honor," the receptionist returned. "Chief Matthews is unavailable. Would you like to leave a message?" Leonard's jaw tightened slightly. "Tell him Judge Carter called regarding the illegal raid on my home last night. He can reach me at this number." He recited his phone number slowly, ensuring there could be no confusion. Next, he dialed Judge Harold Benton, his longtime colleague on the federal bench. Harold answered on the second ring. "Leonard, I was about to call you. Word's already spreading about what happened." "Then you know I need this addressed immediately," Leonard said, reaching for his coffee mug. "Armed officers kicked in my door without a warrant, Harold. They assaulted a federal judge in his own home." There was a long pause on the other end. "Listen, Leonard." Harold's voice had that careful tone he used when delivering unwelcome news. "I've been making calls all morning. Something feels off about this whole thing." "Off how?" "People who should be outraged are being evasive. The police commissioner's office won't take my calls. The mayor's chief of staff gave me some nonsense about looking into it." Harold sighed heavily. "Nobody wants to touch this." Leonard's coffee grew cold as he spent the next hour calling other contacts: the district attorney's office, the police internal affairs division, even the local FBI field office. Each call followed the same pattern: long holds, transferred calls, vague responses, and promises to look into it. At 9:45, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a blocked number. "Judge Carter speaking," he answered. "Judge, this is Captain Rivera, from Internal Affairs." The man's voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I understand you're trying to file a complaint about last night's incident?" "That's correct. Armed officers conducted an illegal raid." Yes, Rivera cut in quickly. "Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. The officers involved are claiming they had actionable intelligence about drug activity at your address." Leonard's grip tightened on his phone. "That's absurd. Where's their warrant? What was their probable cause?" "They're saying it was a confidential informant. Very sensitive case." Rivera paused. "Judge, between us, you might want to slow down with these calls you're making." "Slow down?" Leonard's voice remained level, but his free hand clenched into a fist. "Captain, those officers committed multiple felonies last night." "I understand that, sir. But there are considerations at play here." "Political sensitivities. The only consideration," Leonard said firmly, "is that armed men broke into my home and assaulted me without cause or warrant." Another pause. "Your Honor, no one was seriously hurt. Maybe it's best to handle this quietly. Administrative channels. No need to make waves." Leonard thought of the red marks the handcuffs had left on his wrists, the casual way they'd thrown him to the ground. "I want those officers' names and badge numbers, now." "I'm afraid I can't release that information at this time," Rivera said smoothly. "Ongoing investigation, you understand." "Captain, do not play games with me. I am a federal judge." "Yes, you are," Rivera interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. "And federal judges should understand better than anyone how delicate these situations can be. For everyone involved." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Leonard's mouth tasted bitter. "Are you threatening me, Captain?" "Not at all, Your Honor. Just offering friendly advice." Rivera's voice softened again. "For your sake, Judge, you might want to let this one go." Leonard stared at his phone in silence, the call having ended with a soft click. The morning sun had climbed higher, streaming through his kitchen window and illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. In the distance, a lawnmower droned, and children's voices carried from somewhere down the street. Normal suburban sounds that suddenly felt surreal against what he was experiencing. He looked down at his notepad, filled with names and numbers from his morning of calls. Every person he'd reached had given him the same message, wrapped in different words. Back off. Stay quiet. Let it go. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. His phone sat silent on the table now, but Rivera's words echoed in his mind. The casual way the captain had dismissed armed officers invading a judge's home. The smooth transition from denial to threat. This wasn't just a few officers making a mistake. This was something organized, something with enough power to make an entire system close ranks. Leonard sat very still in his sunny kitchen, his coffee now completely cold, as the full weight of what he was facing settled over him. His decades on the bench had taught him to recognize the shapes of things hidden in plain sight. The choreographed responses, the blocked calls, the veiled threats, they all pointed to something much larger, much more sinister than a simple wrong address. Leonard's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway of the federal courthouse. The familiar path to his chambers felt different today. Every security guard's glance, every clerk's greeting seemed to carry extra weight. He nodded to them, as always, maintaining his usual dignified demeanor, despite the sleepless night evident in the shadows under his eyes. As he rounded the corner to the judge's wing, Harold Benton emerged from his own chambers, carefully closing the heavy wooden door behind him. The older judge's face was drawn with concern. "Leonard," Harold called softly, gesturing him over. "Got a minute?" Inside Harold's chambers, the morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating walls lined with leather-bound law books. Harold closed the door and checked the hallway through its frosted glass panel before turning to face his friend. "I've been making more calls," Harold said, lowering himself into his desk chair. "What I'm hearing? It's worse than we thought." Leonard settled into one of the visitor chairs, noting how Harold's normally steady hands fidgeted with his reading glasses. "Tell me, you've heard of the Metro Drug Enforcement Task Force?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. They're supposedly the elite drug interdiction unit." Leonard leaned forward. "Are you saying they were behind the raid?" Harold nodded grimly. "And not just your raid. I've got a contact in the public defender's office who's been tracking their cases. There's a pattern, Leonard. They're targeting black homeowners, especially in up-and-coming neighborhoods." Leonard's expression remained neutral, but his fingers gripped the chair's armrests tighter. "Explain." "They fabricate probable cause, usually with phantom informants who never materialize in court. They raid homes, rough people up, plant evidence if they have to." Harold removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Most victims take plea deals rather than fight it. The ones who don't, well, their cases tend to disappear. But only after their homes have been seized under civil forfeiture laws." "Asset forfeiture," Leonard said quietly. "They're using drug laws to steal property. The task force gets a percentage of every seizure, and the properties always seem to end up in the hands of certain well-connected developers." Harold's voice had an edge of disgust. "My contact says they've been trying to build a case for months, but nobody will touch it. The task force has protection from somewhere high up." Leonard thought back to his morning of stonewalled phone calls. "That explains the coordinated response." "They didn't know you were a judge when they picked your house," Harold continued. "But now they're scrambling. If you push this, Leonard—" He trailed off, looking older than his years. "They'll come after me," Leonard finished. "They'll try to discredit you first. Paint you as angry, biased, playing the race card. If that doesn't work—" Harold spread his hands helplessly. "These people have resources, connections. They could make your life very difficult." Leonard stood and walked to the window, looking down at the courthouse steps below. He thought of his father, who'd worked 3 jobs to buy their family home in segregated Alabama, only to lose it to a suspicious fire after speaking at a voter registration drive. "How many families?" he asked, without turning around. "What? How many families have they done this to?" Harold sighed heavily. "My contact estimates at least 30 in the past year. Mostly working-class people who'd managed to buy homes in gentrifying areas." Leonard watched a young black couple ascending the courthouse steps, a child between them. He wondered if they were here fighting to keep their home, their dignity, their piece of the American dream. "These officers," he said slowly, "they thought they could kick in my door because they assumed I was just another black man who couldn't fight back." "Leonard," Harold's tone was cautionary, "I know that look. You're thinking of taking this on. But you need to understand, this goes beyond a few corrupt cops. There's serious money involved, political connections. They could destroy your career, everything you've worked for." Leonard turned from the window. "What about everything those families worked for?" "I'm not saying it's right," Harold protested. "But you're one man. Sometimes we have to pick our battles." "No, Harold. Sometimes the battle picks us." Leonard straightened his tie. "Thank you for telling me this. I needed to know what I'm dealing with." "What are you going to do?" "My job," Leonard replied simply. "Uphold the law, protect people's rights. Isn't that what we swore to do?" Harold slumped in his chair. "Just be careful. These people play dirty." Leonard nodded and left his friend's chambers, walking the familiar path back to his own office. The rest of his day passed in a blur of hearings and paperwork but his mind kept returning to Harold's revelations, fitting them together with his own experience like pieces of a dark puzzle. That evening, he drove home slowly, taking in the sight of his neighborhood with new eyes. How many other homes on these quiet streets had been targeted? How many families had been stripped of their dignity and property by badges and guns and lies? He parked in his driveway and walked past the hastily repaired front door, its splintered frame a stark reminder of violated sanctuary. In his living room, everything looked normal. His books, his photographs, his judge's robe still hanging on the wall. But nothing felt normal anymore. Leonard sat in his favorite chair, staring at the damaged doorframe as darkness gathered outside. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of his grandfather clock. Finally, he opened his laptop, created a new folder, and labeled it simply Evidence. Leonard arrived early at Marie's Diner, a modest establishment far enough from the courthouse to avoid the usual lunch crowd. The morning sun cast long shadows through wide windows, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. He chose a corner booth, where he could see both the entrance and the kitchen, an old habit that felt more necessary now. The bell above the door chimed, and Tanya Green stepped inside. Even without her press credentials visible, Leonard recognized her immediately from her byline photo. She carried herself with the alert confidence of someone used to asking hard questions, her natural hair styled professionally, wearing a deep purple blazer over black slacks. Leonard stood as she approached. "Ms. Green, thank you for meeting me. Judge Carter." She shook his hand firmly. "I have to admit, your call surprised me. Federal judges don't usually reach out to journalists directly. These aren't usual circumstances." Leonard gestured for her to sit. A waitress approached with coffee pot in hand. "Can I get you folks started with some coffee?" They both nodded, and Leonard waited until their cups were full and the waitress had moved away before speaking again. "I've read your coverage of police misconduct cases. You're thorough, fearless. That's why I called you." Tanya added cream to her coffee, studying him. "You mentioned something about an illegal raid on your home?" Leonard reached into his briefcase and removed a tablet. "Before I show you this, I need your word that nothing leaves this table until we agree on how to proceed." "Of course." Tanya's expression grew serious. "Whatever you show me is off the record until you say otherwise." Leonard queued up the security footage and handed her the tablet. The video began playing, showing his peaceful living room suddenly invaded by violence. Tanya's hands tightened on the tablet as she watched the officers burst in, their weapons drawn, their voices harsh with manufactured authority. "Oh my God!" she whispered as the scene unfolded. When it reached the moment where the officers noticed his judge's robe, her eyes widened. "They had no idea who you were." "No," Leonard confirmed quietly. "They saw what they expected to see. Just another black man they could terrorize with impunity." Tanya rewound the video, watching key moments again with a journalist's careful eye. "The warrant they claimed to have doesn't exist," Leonard finished. "At least, not legally. I've checked every channel. And when you complained, stonewalled at every level. But it gets worse." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've learned this raid wasn't random. There's a corrupt task force targeting black homeowners, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods. They fabricate probable cause, conduct illegal raids, and use civil forfeiture laws to seize properties." Tanya's reporter instincts visibly kicked in. She pulled out a small notebook. "How many cases?" "At least 30 families in the past year. The properties end up in the hands of certain developers. The task force gets a cut of every seizure." "Names of the developers?" "Not yet. But I have evidence of the pattern, including my own security footage. What I don't have is the reach to make it public effectively." Tanya sat back, processing. You're a federal judge. You could file complaints, launch investigations. Through the same system that's already shown it will protect its own? Leonard shook his head. This needs to come from outside. The public needs to see what's happening. These families need to know they're not alone. A few moments passed as Tanya sipped her coffee, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. You understand what you're risking? They'll come after you hard. Try to discredit you. Maybe worse. I do. And you're still willing to go public? Leonard's voice remained steady, but his eyes held decades of contained fury. Ms. Green, I grew up watching my father fight for basic dignity in Alabama. I became a judge because I believed in the power of law to protect people. If I stay silent now, knowing what I know, you couldn't live with yourself, she finished, nodding slowly. Exactly. Tanya closed her notebook and looked him directly in the eyes. Judge Carter, I need you to be absolutely certain. Once we start this, there's no going back. They'll try to destroy both of us. I'm certain. She studied him for a long moment, then reached for her bag and pulled out a small recording device. Then let's do this right. I'll need detailed interviews, all the evidence you've gathered, and help connecting with other victims. We'll need to build this story carefully. Make it bulletproof. Agreed. Leonard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not because the path ahead would be easier, but because he no longer walked it alone. Tanya pressed the record button. Before we start, I want you to know something. I grew up in one of those neighborhoods they target. My aunt lost her house to a suspicious drug raid 10 years ago. Never found any drugs, but she lost everything fighting the seizure. Her voice hardened with determination. If they think they can silence a federal judge, imagine what they're doing to everyone else. Let's expose them. The afternoon sun beat down as Leonard and Tanya walked the tree-lined streets of his neighborhood. Leonard had changed into casual clothes, a polo shirt and khakis, to help people feel more at ease. Every few houses, they stopped to knock on doors. Most folks around here keep to themselves, Leonard explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. After what happened to me, I understand why. Tanya nodded, notebook ready. Fear keeps communities silent. But sometimes all it takes is one person speaking up to break that silence. At the first few houses, they found only empty porches and drawn curtains. Those who did answer spoke in whispers, glancing nervously at passing cars. One elderly woman quickly shut her door when Tanya mentioned police raids. They're terrified, Tanya muttered, scribbling notes. This is worse than I thought. On Cedar Street, they met Mr. Washington, a retired postal worker tending his roses. His hands shook as he described what he'd witnessed 6 months ago. It was just like what happened to you, Judge, he said, leaning on his garden rake. 3 houses down. The Martinez family. Good people. Never caused trouble. Police came at midnight with some big truck. Broke down their door with one of those rams. Did they find anything illegal? Tanya asked. Mr. Washington shook his head. Nothing. But 2 weeks later, the family was gone. House got sold real quick, too. Below market value, from what I heard. Leonard made note of the address. Did anyone try to help them? Who could we call? The police were the ones doing it. Mr. Washington's voice cracked. Their little girl used to play with my granddaughter, 7 years old. I still remember her screaming when they threw those flash grenades inside. 2 blocks over, they found Mrs. Thompson, a schoolteacher who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. She invited them into her kitchen, serving them ice water while she talked. It's not just the raids, she explained, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the tablecloth. There's intimidation, too. Patrol cars sitting outside people's houses all night. Officers taking pictures of children walking to school. Citations for the smallest things. Grass too long, trash cans left out an hour too long. Creating pretexts, Tanya said. Building paper trails to justify harassment. Exactly. Mrs. Thompson lowered her voice. The Williams family next door got 7 citations in 1 month. Then suddenly there's a drug warrant? James Williams worked at the post office for 20 years. Never touched drugs in his life. Leonard felt his jaw tighten. Where are they now? Moved in with relatives in Georgia. Lost everything fighting the property seizure. As they walked down Maple Avenue, they saw children being hurried inside by worried parents. Blinds snapped shut as they passed. The fear was palpable, hanging in the air like the afternoon humidity. 4 families, Tanya counted, reviewing her notes. All gone within months. All their homes resold quickly. And those are just the ones we know about, Leonard added grimly. They approached a small yellow house with carefully tended flower beds. Before they could knock, a middle-aged Latina woman emerged from behind a rose bush, gardening shears in hand. Mrs. Alvarez. Leonard stepped forward. I'm Judge Carter from down the street. This is Ms. Green from the Daily Herald. Mrs. Alvarez straightened up, wiping soil from her hands. Yes, I know who you are, Judge. I saw what they did to your house. Her accent was slight, her eyes wary but determined. You're asking about the raids? If you're willing to talk about them, Tanya said gently. Mrs. Alvarez glanced up and down the street, then gestured for them to follow her inside. The house was modest, but immaculate, family photos covering the walls. She disappeared into another room and returned with a manila envelope. This isn't about me, she said, pulling out wrinkled papers. It's about my son Miguel. He bought his first house last year, over on Oak Street. Worked 2 jobs for the down payment. He was so proud. Her voice caught. She spread the papers on her coffee table. An eviction notice, property seizure documents, court orders. Leonard recognized the task force letterhead immediately. They said they found drug residue in his trash, Mrs. Alvarez continued. Claimed they had an informant. But Miguel works in accounting. He doesn't even drink alcohol. She handed the crumpled eviction notice to Leonard. Look who signed it. Leonard studied the signature, his blood running cold. It was the same officer who had led the raid on his home, the same task force. But the date on the notice was from 8 months ago, long before his incident. They took everything, Mrs. Alvarez said softly. His savings, his furniture, even his car. Said it was all bought with drug money. He's living in my basement now, trying to rebuild his life. Tanya photographed each document while Leonard examined the legal language. The pattern was identical to the other cases, but something was different. Miguel Alvarez wasn't black. He was Latino. Mrs. Alvarez, Leonard said carefully, do you know of other Latino families this has happened to? She nodded slowly. 3 on Oak Street alone. All young homeowners, all first-generation Americans. We thought we were being targeted because of immigration. But then we heard about what was happening in other neighborhoods. Leonard exchanged glances with Tanya. The scope wasn't just wider than they'd imagined. It was systematic. The task force wasn't just targeting black families. They were going after any vulnerable homeowners they thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. The sun had set by the time Leonard turned onto his street. His head was still spinning from all the stories they'd collected, each one more disturbing than the last. As he approached his driveway, his headlights caught something odd. The car seemed to be sitting lower on one side. Leonard parked and stepped out, his shoes crunching on loose gravel. The sound of crickets filled the evening air as he walked around his car. His heart sank. All 4 tires were slashed, the rubber hanging in ragged strips. Quite a message, he muttered, pulling out his phone to take pictures. The flash illuminated deep cuts in the sidewalls. This wasn't random vandalism. These were deliberate, precise cuts meant to ensure the tires couldn't be patched. As he documented the damage, something white caught his eye near the front door. A piece of paper lay folded on his welcome mat. Leonard approached cautiously, using his phone's flashlight to examine it before touching anything. The note was typed on plain printer paper, no fingerprints visible in the harsh light. 2 words in bold letters: "Stop digging." Leonard carefully picked up the note using a tissue from his pocket. Inside his house, he sealed it in a plastic bag, preserving any evidence it might contain. His security cameras would have caught whoever left it. He'd review the footage later. The house felt different now. Shadows seemed deeper. Ordinary creaks more ominous. Leonard double-checked his locks, then poured himself a glass of water with slightly shaking hands. He wasn't afraid, exactly. But the reality of what he was up against was starting to sink in. His phone rang, making him jump. Tanya's name flashed on the screen. "Leonard?" Her voice was tight, controlled. "We need to talk." "I was about to call you," he said, sitting down heavily in his armchair. "Someone left me a welcome gift." "They got to you too?" She gave a harsh laugh. "My editor just called me into his office. Said if I pursue this story, I'll be fired for violating journalistic ethics by getting too personally involved." Leonard closed his eyes. "They're moving fast." "It gets worse," Tanya continued. "He showed me a file, pictures of me talking to sources for other stories, meetings I thought were private. They've been watching me, Leonard, building a case to discredit anything I might write." "Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm at my sister's house. Didn't want to go home tonight." She paused. Maybe we should back off for a while. Let things cool down." Leonard stood, walking to where his judge's robe still hung on the wall. He touched the fabric, remembering the moment those officers saw it, how quickly their arrogance turned to fear. "Tanya," he said quietly, "that's exactly what they want. Think about it. They didn't just slash my tires. They left evidence. They didn't just threaten to fire you. They showed their hand about the surveillance. They want us scared. They want us to know they're watching. But why show their cards like that? Because they're desperate." Leonard began pacing. "We've collected 12 testimonies today alone. Property records, eviction notices, warrant applications, all pointing to the same task force, the same pattern of abuse. And now we know it's not just racial profiling. It's systematic property theft, targeting anyone they think is vulnerable." "My editor mentioned something else," Tanya said slowly. "He said this could damage important relationships between the paper and city officials." "Leonard, I think this goes higher than the police department." "Of course it does." Leonard walked to his study, pulling out the folder where he'd been collecting evidence. "Think about the property sales Mrs. Alvarez mentioned. Houses seized and resold quickly, below market value. Where's that money going? Who's buying these properties? We'd need access to real estate records, transaction histories, which I can subpoena, once we have enough evidence to open a federal investigation." Leonard carefully placed the threatening note into the folder. "They're not just trying to scare us, Tanya. They're trying to stop us before we connect all the dots." There was a long silence on the phone. When Tanya spoke again, her voice was stronger. "My editor gave me till morning to reconsider my position. Said the paper would accept my resignation if I wanted to leave quietly." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I didn't become a journalist to leave quietly." She took a deep breath. "But Leonard, these people, they're not going to stop at slashed tires and threats." "No," he agreed. "They won't. The question is, will we?" Another pause. Leonard could hear her typing something. "I just emailed you something interesting," she said. "Property records for 3 of the seized houses. Different buyers on paper, but look at the notary signatures." Leonard opened his laptop, clicking on her email. "They're all the same person. A name I recognize from City Hall," Tanya added. "If they're this desperate to shut us down, then we're close," Leonard finished, adding the new documents to his evidence folder. too close for them to risk letting us continue. Morning sunlight streamed across Leonard's front lawn as people began to gather. He'd chosen 9 a.m. deliberately, early enough to catch the morning news cycle, late enough for working people to attend. Tanya stood beside him on his porch, her press badge hanging around her neck, looking tired but determined after their sleepless night. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some carrying handmade signs demanding justice. Mrs. Alvarez brought folding chairs for the elderly. Children peered curiously from behind their parents' legs. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like metal flowers. Leonard adjusted his tie, watching the crowd grow. He'd chosen to wear his most formal suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, but deliberately left his judge's robe inside. This wasn't about his position. It was about justice. "Ready?" Tanya asked softly, holding her notebook. Leonard nodded, stepping up to the simple podium they'd set up. Behind him, a large white screen hung from his porch overhang. A projector sat ready on a small table. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying across the lawn without need for amplification. "My name is Leonard Carter. Many of you know me as a federal judge. But last week, I was simply a black man in my own home when this happened." He pressed a button on the remote. The security footage began to play. The image was crystal clear. His front door exploding inward, wood splintering. Armed officers pouring in, weapons raised. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:47 p.m. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "That's wrong!" A mother pulled her young son closer. Leonard let the footage continue. The officers' shouts were clearly audible. "Get down! On the ground, now!" Then came the moment when they spotted his robe. The sudden silence. The hasty retreat. He stopped the video. "This was not a mistake," he said firmly. "This was not a wrong address. This was part of a pattern. A systematic campaign of intimidation and property theft targeting black homeowners in our community." Cameras clicked rapidly. Reporters scribbled in notepads. Leonard gestured to Tanya, who began handing out packets of documentation to the media representatives. "In these packets, you'll find evidence of similar raids across our neighborhood. Fabricated warrants, forced evictions, properties seized and resold at suspicious prices. But most importantly, you'll find the stories of your neighbors, ordinary citizens terrorized in their own homes." Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "They came for my son's house last month. Said they had evidence of drugs. There were no drugs. Now, my grandchildren live in a motel." More neighbors began speaking up, sharing their stories. Leonard watched as reporters' expressions shifted from professional interest to genuine shock. This wasn't just about one judge's experience anymore. It was about a community under siege. "Last night," Leonard continued, "after collecting these testimonies, my tires were slashed. A threatening note was left on my doorstep." He held up the bagged note. "But we will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated." Tanya stepped forward. "I'm Tanya Green, investigative reporter. Despite threats to my career, I'm releasing a comprehensive report on this task force's activities. The evidence points to a coordinated effort involving not just police officers, but city officials profiting from these illegal seizures." She held up property records. Same notary signatures. Same buyers operating under different shell companies, all connected to City Hall. Leonard watched as reporters began frantically making phone calls, sending texts. Social media notifications pinged across the crowd as people shared the video in real time. "We stand here today," Leonard said, his voice growing stronger. "Not just as victims, but as citizens demanding accountability. This stops now." The questions erupted. "Judge Carter, will you be filing federal charges?" "Ms. Green. Can you name the city officials involved? What about the police chief's response? Leonard raised his hands for quiet. All evidence has been submitted to the appropriate federal authorities. But more importantly, it's now in the public domain. You can't bury what everyone can see. Inside Leonard's living room an hour later, he and Tanya watched the story explode across social media. The footage played on every local channel. National news networks picked it up. Judges' raid and Tarink's police accountability trended on Twitter. "Look at this," Tanya said, scrolling through her phone. "Similar stories coming in from other neighborhoods, other cities. We broke something open here." Leonard nodded, watching his security footage play again on CNN. The comments sections filled with outrage, demands for investigation, calls for reform. "They'll try to spin it," he warned. "Say it's isolated incidents, bad apples. Let them try." Tanya showed him another viral post, his words about not being silenced overlaid on an image of his judge's robe. People are listening now. Really listening. Leonard's phone buzzed with messages of support from other judges, civil rights attorneys, community leaders. Each notification felt like a small victory, a crack in the wall of silence that had protected this corruption. "For the first time," Tanya said, watching the view counts climb, "I think we might actually win this." Outside, more neighbors gathered on his lawn, sharing their stories with reporters who hadn't made it to the morning press conference. The truth was spreading, person by person, click by click, impossible to contain. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Leonard walked through the courthouse's marble hallway. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor, each step feeling heavier than usual. 5 days had passed since the press conference, and the story had spread like wildfire across the nation. He nodded to Janet, his longtime clerk, as he approached his chambers. Her face looked strained, worried. Something was off. "Judge Carter," she said softly, "there are people waiting in your office." Leonard paused, noting the unusual tension in her voice. Through the frosted glass of his door, he could make out several dark figures standing inside. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. 3 men in expensive suits turned to face him. He recognized Marcus Wheeler, the chief administrative judge, and 2 members of the Judicial Review Board. Their expressions were carefully blank, professional masks hiding whatever they really felt. "Leonard," Wheeler said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Please, have a seat." "In my own chambers?" Leonard remained standing, his voice calm but firm. Wheeler cleared his throat and handed over a thick envelope. "This is difficult. But given recent events and the media attention they've generated, we're required to take action." Leonard opened the envelope, his fingers steady, despite the anger building in his chest. The document inside was printed on official letterhead. "Notice of immediate suspension of judicial duties, pending review." "The grounds?" Leonard asked, though he already knew. One of the review board members, Thompson, stepped forward. "Questions have been raised about your ability to remain impartial, particularly in cases involving law enforcement." He gestured to a stack of papers. "We've received numerous complaints about past rulings that show a consistent pattern of—" "Of what?" Leonard interrupted. "Of holding officers accountable when they break the law?" "Of bias," Wheeler said firmly. "The police union has submitted a comprehensive review of your cases from the past 5 years. The statistics suggest I believe in justice," Leonard said. "Show me one ruling that wasn't supported by law and evidence." Thompson pulled out several newspaper printouts. The headlines screamed in bold type, "Activist Judge or Judicial Activist? Carter's Crusade, a history of anti-police bias. Federal Judge's Vendetta against Law Enforcement exposed." Leonard recognized the bylines, all from media outlets known for their cozy relationships with police unions. They'd cherry-picked his most controversial cases, stripped them of context, and twisted them into weapons against him. Your recent public statements, Wheeler continued, have created an appearance of impropriety that— An appearance of impropriety? Leonard's voice remained level, but ice crept into his tone. What about the impropriety of armed officers breaking down my door without cause? What about the impropriety of systematic harassment of black homeowners? That matter is under separate investigation, Thompson said quickly. But your public accusations, without waiting for proper channels— Proper channels? Leonard placed the suspension notice carefully on his desk. Like the channels I tried to use the morning after the raid? The ones that threatened me to let it go? Wheeler shifted uncomfortably. Leonard, please, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Step back quietly, let the review process work. If you're cleared— When? Leonard corrected. When I'm cleared. He began gathering his personal items from the desk. A framed photo of his parents, a worn copy of the Constitution, his favorite fountain pen. The men watched in uncomfortable silence. You have until end of day to clear out any personal effects, Thompson said. Your cases will be redistributed. During the review period, you're not to make any public statements about— I know the procedures, Leonard cut him off. I've been on the bench longer than you've been practicing law. Janet appeared in the doorway, tears in her eyes. Judge Carter, I'm so sorry. The press is gathering outside. Someone leaked. Of course they did, Leonard said softly. He placed his belongings in his briefcase, each movement deliberate and dignified. Janet, would you please make copies of everything in my files regarding the task force investigation? Send them to Tanya Green at the paper, and to my home address. You can't remove case files, Wheeler protested. These are personal records, Marcus. Evidence of crimes committed against me and my neighbors. Unless you're suggesting those should disappear too? The implied accusation hung in the air. Wheeler looked away first. Leonard walked to the coat rack and pulled down his judge's robe. He ran his fingers over the fabric, remembering the day he first put it on, the oath he'd sworn. With careful movements, he folded it and placed it in his briefcase. Gentlemen, he said, turning to face them one last time, I look forward to the review board's findings. I trust they'll be as thorough in examining my record as they are in investigating armed home invasions by police officers. He walked out without waiting for a response, head high as he passed clusters of whispering courthouse staff. News cameras flashed through the windows of the lobby. Reporters pressed against the glass, shouting questions he couldn't hear. In the parking garage, Leonard sat in his car, staring at the courthouse steps visible through his windshield. The building's classical columns rose into the sky, meant to symbolize the permanence of justice. Now they felt like prison bars. His phone buzzed continuously. Messages from colleagues, friends, reporters. The headlines would be everywhere by now. His career, built over decades of careful, principled work, was under attack. His reputation was being smeared in real time. Leonard's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He could feel the fury building in his chest. Not the hot rage of youth, but something colder, more focused. They picked the wrong man, he whispered to himself, his words echoing in the empty car. Tanya's office was a cramped space, tucked away in a corner of the newspaper building. At night, with most of the staff gone, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across stacks of papers and old coffee cups. Leonard sat in a worn chair beside her cluttered desk, his suit jacket draped over the back, his tie loosened. They can't just suspend you like that, Tanya fumed, pacing between filing cabinets. It's obviously retaliation. They can, and they did. Leonard rubbed his tired eyes. But that's not what matters right now. Show me what you found. Tanya nodded and pulled out a thick manila folder. I've been digging into the task force's financial records. public documents, property transfers, civil asset forfeitures. She spread papers across her desk, pushing aside a half-eaten sandwich. At first, nothing looked unusual, but then I started cross-referencing the dates and addresses of their raids. Leonard leaned forward, scanning the documents. His years of experience reading legal papers helped him spot patterns quickly. These property seizures, they're all in predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Exactly. Tanya pulled up a map on her computer screen, red dots marking each raid location. Look at the cluster pattern. They're targeting specific areas, specific demographics. Leonard's finger traced a line of addresses. Mrs. Alvarez's son's house is here. And this one? He tapped another dot. I remember this case. Family of 4. Father worked as a bus driver. They claimed they found drug residue, but the lab tests came back negative. By then, it didn't matter, Tanya said, her voice bitter. They'd already seized the house, sold it at auction. The family couldn't afford to fight it in court. Leonard pulled another document closer, squinting at the fine print. Who's this company? Urban Renewal Partners, LLC? Tanya's eyes lit up. She quickly typed on her keyboard, pulling up corporate registration documents. That's where it gets interesting. Urban Renewal Partners was formed 3 years ago, right when the task force ramped up its operations. Look who's on the board. Leonard read the names, his jaw tightening. James Morrison, retired police captain. Robert Weeks, former city council member. And, he paused, anger flashing in his eyes. Thomas Bradley, current head of the police union. The same police union that's leading the smear campaign against you, Tanya confirmed. She pulled out more papers, spreading them in a timeline. Here's how it works. The task force raids homes on bogus warrants. They claim to find drugs or other contraband, but the evidence always seems to disappear before court challenges. Civil asset forfeiture, Leonard muttered. They don't need a conviction. Just probable cause. Right. The homes get seized, the families get kicked out. Urban Renewal Partners buys the properties at auction, way below market value. They flip them or hold them until gentrification drives up the prices. Leonard started connecting documents, creating a web of transactions. The task force officers get performance bonuses based on seizure values. Their supervisors get kickbacks through consulting fees from Urban Renewal. And the union, he shook his head in disgust. The union provides political cover and blocks investigations. Tanya pulled up bank records on her screen. I tracked the money. Millions of dollars, all flowing through shell companies and offshore accounts. But it always leads back to the same people. They're not just taking homes, Leonard said quietly. They're destroying communities. Families that took generations to build wealth, to own property, gone in a single night because some corrupt cops wanted to turn a profit. And when someone fights back, Tanya gestured at a stack of newspaper clippings, they use their media connections to destroy reputations. How many other judges have they intimidated? How many prosecutors have looked the other way? Leonard stood up, walking to the window. The city lights sparkled below, peaceful from this distance. But he knew better now. He knew what was happening in those quiet neighborhoods, behind closed doors and falsified warrants. We need to organize all of this, he said, turning back to Tanya. Every raid, every property transfer, every dollar. Build a timeline showing the pattern. Tanya was already pulling out fresh notepads. I have sources in the assessor's office, the county clerk. We can get more records, track every property they've touched. They worked in focused silence for the next hour, sorting documents into categories. Financial records, property transfers, personnel files, witness statements. The story emerged clearly now, each piece fitting into a larger puzzle of corruption and greed. Look at this, Tanya said suddenly, holding up a spreadsheet. They have quotas, monthly targets for property values. The task force leaders get bonuses if they exceed them. Leonard took the paper, his expression hardening as he read. They're treating it like a business, turning police power into profit. He picked up another document, comparing figures. And look, the raids always spike near the end of each quarter, when they're trying to hit their numbers. That explains why they came after you, Tanya said. Your house. The property value alone would have met their quota for the month. They didn't know I was a judge, Leonard said. They just saw a black man living in a nice house. An easy target. He paused, looking at a photo of a family being evicted. But they've been doing this for years. Hundreds of families. Millions of dollars. Tanya watched him as he studied the evidence they'd gathered. Despite his suspension, despite the attacks on his reputation, his focus hadn't wavered. If anything, the attempts to silence him had only strengthened his resolve. Leonard looked up from the documents, his voice firm with controlled anger. This isn't just misconduct. This is organized crime wearing badges. Leonard's living room had been transformed. Where police boots had once thundered across his floor, now sat circles of folding chairs filled with families from across the city. The splintered doorframe remained. Leonard had refused to repair it, letting it stand as a reminder of that night. Tanya set up her recording equipment on the coffee table, testing the microphone levels. Evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across worried faces. Some people fidgeted nervously. Others sat stone still, their stories waiting to be told. Thank you all for coming, Leonard said, standing before them in casual clothes, a deliberate choice to help everyone feel more comfortable. I know it wasn't easy to agree to this, but your stories need to be heard. A middle-aged man raised his hand hesitantly. Judge Carter, what if they come after us like they're coming after you? That's exactly why we need to stand together, Leonard replied. They count on our silence, on our fear. But there's power in numbers, and there's power in truth. Tanya nodded, pressing the record button. Everything you say will be documented. Names can be changed if you prefer. But these stories, your stories, are our strongest weapon. The first to speak was an elderly woman named Mrs. Washington. Her hands trembled as she described how officers had burst into her home of 40 years at 3 a.m. They said they had a tip about drugs. My grandson was visiting. He's an honor student at Howard University. They put him in handcuffs, made him lie face down. Her voice cracked. They went through everything, tore up my family photos, broke my mother's china. Found nothing, of course. But they still took my house. Said my grandson's presence made it a drug-related property. Others began sharing similar stories. A taxi driver described how officers had seized his entire life savings, cash he'd been saving for his daughter's college fund. They said only drug dealers carry that much cash. 20 years of driving double shifts, gone in minutes. A young father, holding his 4-year-old son, spoke next. They came during dinner. My boy still has nightmares about the guns, the shouting. The child buried his face in his father's shirt. We lost everything. Had to move in with my sister. They said they found drug residue in the kitchen. It was powdered sugar from my wife's baking business. Leonard noticed patterns in their stories. The same officers' names kept coming up. The same tactics. The same threats to stay quiet. Tanya took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and addresses. A teenager, sitting between her parents, described how officers had mocked her family's accent while ransacking their home. They kept saying we must be hiding something because we're immigrants. They took Mom's jewelry, said it was probably bought with drug money. That was her grandmother's jewelry from Ecuador. Did they show you a warrant? Leonard asked gently. They waved some paper, the girl's father said, but they wouldn't let us read it. When I asked to call our lawyer, They said that would make things worse for us. More stories poured out. A nurse described losing her home because her nephew, who had stayed with her briefly, had a marijuana conviction from years ago. A retired teacher showed pictures of her ransacked bedroom, precious family heirlooms missing after the raid. A small business owner explained how the task force had seized his food truck, claiming it was purchased with suspicious funds. Leonard listened intently to each story, his anger building quietly, but his exterior remaining calm and supportive. These weren't just cases or statistics. These were lives torn apart by greed masked as law enforcement. A young mother named Sarah, holding a sleeping toddler, spoke about how the raids had affected her entire block. It's like they were working their way down the street. Every month, another Black or Hispanic family would disappear. The houses would sit empty. Then suddenly they'd be renovated and sold to new people. People who looked nothing like us. Tanya's recorder captured it all. The trembling voices, the suppressed sobs, the moments of anger breaking through fear. She knew these testimonies would be powerful evidence, not just of individual crimes, but of a systematic assault on entire communities. As the evening drew to a close, many stayed to talk among themselves, finding comfort in shared experiences. Leonard watched as people exchanged phone numbers, offered support, began forming the kinds of connections that could sustain a long fight for justice. Sarah, the young mother who had spoken about her block, approached Leonard last. Her sleeping child had awakened and clung to her neck, watching Leonard with curious eyes. "Judge Carter," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "I was so scared to come tonight. Scared they'd find out, that they'd target us again." She squeezed his hand. "But seeing you, seeing how you're fighting back even after what they did to your career," her eyes filled with tears, "you give us hope. If you can stand up to them, so can we." Leonard felt his resolve deepen as he looked at Sarah and her child, at all the families sharing their pain and courage in his living room. The task force had tried to break him with threats and smear campaigns, but they'd given him something far more powerful than fear. They'd given him a cause worth fighting for, and a community ready to stand with him. The marble halls of the Capitol echoed with footsteps as Leonard Carter walked toward the hearing room, his evidence briefcase heavy with the weight of hundreds of shattered lives. Tanya Green fell into step beside him, her press badge swinging with each stride. "You ready for this?" she asked quietly. Leonard adjusted his tie. "Been ready since the night they kicked in my door." The hearing room buzzed with tension. Rows of polished wooden benches filled with journalists, activists, and families who'd flown in from across the country. Some of the raid survivors Leonard had interviewed sat together near the front, including Mrs. Washington and Sarah with her young child. Their presence strengthened his resolve. At the raised committee table, 7 senators settled into their chairs, shuffling papers and adjusting microphones. Leonard recognized Senator Diana Martinez, known for her fierce advocacy against police corruption, sitting in the center position. Tanya squeezed Leonard's arm before finding her seat in the press section. She pulled out her recorder, determined to capture every word of what was about to unfold. Leonard walked to the witness table, placing his hand on the Bible. After being sworn in, he sat down and adjusted his microphone. The room fell silent. "Judge Carter," Senator Martinez began, "you're here today to present evidence regarding alleged systematic civil rights violations by the Metro Police Department's Special Task Force. Please proceed." Leonard's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "Thank you, Senator. 3 months ago, armed officers broke down my door in the middle of the night, claiming to have a warrant for a drug search. They didn't know they were raiding a federal judge's home. But more importantly, they didn't know I had security cameras." He nodded to a staff member who played the raid footage on large screens around the room. "The violent entry the shouting officers, the moment they spotted his judge's robe. It all unfolded in stark detail. Several senators leaned forward, frowning. This was not an isolated incident, Leonard continued. Working with investigative journalist Tanya Green, we uncovered evidence of a coordinated scheme targeting minority homeowners across the city. He opened his briefcase, removing stacks of documents. These are falsified warrant applications, all following the same template. These are financial records showing properties seized through these raids being quickly resold at massive profits. And these, he lifted a thick folder, are testimonies from families whose lives were destroyed. Leonard's voice remained steady as he read from Sarah's statement. They took everything we spent years building. Our home, our savings, our dignity. All based on lies. Senator Martinez studied a document. Judge Carter, these warrant applications appear to have irregularities. Can you elaborate? The task force repeatedly used a single confidential informant as justification for dozens of raids. An informant who, our investigation reveals, doesn't exist. They fabricated evidence to target specific homes. Homes that were later seized and sold through a network of shell companies. A murmur rippled through the audience. Leonard produced more papers. These documents show the flow of money from seized properties through various accounts. But most disturbing is where those profits ultimately led. He slid several financial reports across the table. Account statements showing regular payments to shell companies owned by Police Chief Alan Doyle and Mayor Charles Whitmore. They weren't just aware of this program, they were directly profiting from it. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several senators bent their heads together, whispering urgently. In the audience, Tanya gripped her recorder tighter, her eyes wide. The evidence is clear, Leonard said. This task force operated as an organized criminal enterprise, using police power to steal homes and wealth from minority communities. They targeted people they thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. He gestured to the families in the audience. But these citizens are fighting back. They're here today because they refuse to be silent victims of state-sanctioned theft. Senator Martinez held up one of the documents, her face stern. These signatures. You're certain these are from Chief Doyle and Mayor Whitmore? Yes, Senator. They personally approved each raid and property seizure. The dates and amounts correspond directly to suspicious deposits in their hidden accounts. Another senator, a former prosecutor, leaned into his microphone. Judge Carter, based on these documents, we're looking at potential RICO charges. Conspiracy, fraud, civil rights violations, multiple federal crimes. That's correct, Senator. This wasn't overzealous policing. This was a criminal enterprise operating under color of law. Leonard produced one final document. This internal memo shows Chief Doyle explicitly directing officers to target low-risk, high-value properties, meaning homes owned by minority families who lacked resources to fight back. The task force called it Operation Clean Sweep. The chamber erupted in angry mutters. Senator Martinez raised her hand for quiet, her expression fierce. Judge Carter, I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this evidence forward, particularly given the retaliation you've faced. She turned to address the full room, her voice ringing with authority. Based on this testimony and these documents, I am calling for immediate criminal charges against all involved parties. Chief Doyle, Mayor Whitmore, and every officer who participated in these illegal raids will face federal prosecution. The evening news blared from every TV in the city. Leonard watched from his living room as helicopter footage showed FBI agents leading handcuffed officers from the police station. The crawling text beneath read, Massive corruption scandal. Federal arrests in police raid scheme. Following explosive testimony from federal Judge Leonard Carter, the news anchor reported. Authorities have arrested 12 officers involved in illegal home raids targeting minority communities. Police Chief Alan Doyle was taken into custody this morning on multiple federal charges. The camera cut to Chief Doyle being escorted out in handcuffs, his polished appearance now disheveled. His eyes darted nervously as reporters shouted questions. It was a far cry from his usual controlled demeanor. Additionally, Mayor Charles Whitmore has announced his immediate resignation, the anchor continued. Sources say he is cooperating with federal prosecutors. Leonard's phone buzzed. It was Tanya. "You seeing this?" she asked excitedly. "Every second," Leonard replied, allowing himself a small smile. "Turn to Channel 4. They're showing the protests outside City Hall." He changed channels. Hundreds of people filled the streets, many holding signs reading, "Justice at last," and "Thank you, Judge Carter." Among them, he recognized faces from the community meetings, Mrs. Washington leading a chant, Sarah holding her child high on her shoulders. "The people needed this win," Tanya said. "You gave them hope when nobody else would listen." On screen, federal agents emerged from City Hall carrying boxes of documents. The task force offices were being raided, every file seized for evidence. Leonard's other phone line beeped. "Hold on, Tanya. I have another call." It was Harold Benton, his colleague from the bench. "Leonard, the Judicial Review Board just voted. Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately. They're issuing a formal apology for how you were treated." Leonard closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. "Thank you, Harold." "No, thank you." "What you exposed, it's bigger than just our city. Other jurisdictions are already launching investigations into their task forces. You've started something important." After hanging up, Leonard stood before the repaired front door of his home, remembering that violent night that started it all. The splintered wood was gone, replaced by solid oak, but the memory remained, along with the lesson it taught about standing firm against injustice. The next morning, Leonard parked in his usual spot at the courthouse. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed something different. People were gathering, court staff, lawyers, community members. They lined the steps, creating a path. Mrs. Alvarez was there with her son. Sarah stood nearby with other raid survivors. Tanya waited at the top of the steps, camera in hand but not filming, just present as a friend. Leonard climbed slowly, nodding to familiar faces. Inside, more people filled the courthouse halls. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing smiles and nods of respect as he passed. In his chambers, Leonard found his judge's robe waiting, the same one that had stopped the raiders in their tracks that night. He ran his fingers over the fabric, feeling its weight and meaning. A clerk knocked softly. "Judge Carter? Your courtroom is ready." Leonard draped the robe across his shoulders, adjusting the white collar. In the mirror, he saw not just himself, but everything the robe represented: the law, justice, the trust of the community. The bailiff's voice carried through the door. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Leonard Carter presiding." Leonard entered his courtroom with measured steps. The gallery was packed with community members, many standing since all seats were taken. As he moved toward the bench, spontaneous applause broke out. It rolled through the courtroom like thunder. He raised his hand, waiting for silence. The applause slowly faded, but the energy remained, hope and vindication filling the air like electricity. Sarah sat in the front row, her child now wearing a T-shirt that read, "Future Judge, Mrs." Washington dabbed tears with a handkerchief. Even some of the attorneys, usually stoic, seemed moved by the moment. Leonard took his seat, surveying the full courtroom. Here was the law as it should be, not a weapon to oppress, but a shield to protect. Not a tool for profit, but an instrument of justice. "Be seated," he said, his voice clear and strong. The room settled. Leonard picked up his gavel, its familiar weight reassuring in his hand. He glanced at the day's docket. ready to begin. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting warm light across the judicial seal behind him. In that moment, Leonard felt the full circle of his journey, from a man defending his home to a symbol of justice, restored. But more importantly, he saw in the faces before him a community that had found its voice, people who would no longer be silent in the face of corruption. Citizens who had learned that justice, while sometimes delayed, could not be denied when people stood together. The bailiff called the first case. Leonard leaned forward, ready to do what he had always done, uphold the law with wisdom and fairness. Only now, his robe carried an even deeper meaning. It was no longer just a symbol of judicial authority, but a reminder that justice could prevail even in the darkest moments. The gallery watched with quiet respect as Leonard began the day's proceedings, his voice steady and sure, carrying the weight of truth finally brought to light. The evening settled softly over Leonard's suburban street. Through his new front door, warm lamplight spilled onto the porch where neighbors gathered, their voices a gentle murmur of conversation. Inside his living room, Leonard sat in his favorite armchair, watching as Tanya arranged chairs in a loose circle with help from Mrs. Washington and several other community members. The room had been transformed since that violent night. Fresh paint covered the walls where the raiders' boots had left scuff marks. The splintered door frame was replaced with solid oak. But one thing remained unchanged. His judge's robe still hung in its place of honor, its presence now carrying even deeper meaning. "Still can't believe how much has changed," Sarah said, settling onto the couch with her young son beside her. The boy clutched a small toy gavel Leonard had given him, a playful nod to his future judge t-shirt. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her eyes bright. 6 months ago, we were all afraid to even talk about what was happening. Now look at us." Leonard smiled, noting how naturally his neighbors filled his home. What started as a violation had somehow built something stronger, a community united against injustice. Tanya set down her reporter's notebook, for once not working but simply present as a friend. "The latest numbers came in," she said. 28 families have already gotten their homes back. The restitution fund is growing. And 3 more cities launched investigations into their task forces, added Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who'd lost his car to a fraudulent seizure. "What happened here is spreading." Through the window, Leonard could see more people arriving, gathering on his front lawn with candles. The informal vigils had become a weekly tradition, a quiet statement that the community would never again be silenced. Mrs. Washington reached out and patted Leonard's hand. "You gave us our dignity back," she said softly. "Not just by fighting them, but by showing us how to fight the right way." "I only did what the law required," Leonard replied, his usual modest response. "No," Tanya interjected firmly. "You did what justice required. There's a difference." The room hummed with murmurs of agreement. On the coffee table, newspapers showed the continuing fallout. More arrests, policy changes, reforms spreading across departments. But the real change was visible in the faces around him, people who now walked taller, spoke louder, knew their worth. Sarah's son tugged at Leonard's sleeve. "Tell the story again," he pleaded. "About the night they came." "Now, Tommy," his mother started, but Leonard raised his hand. "It's important to remember," he said, "not the fear, but what came after." He leaned forward in his chair. "I was sitting right here, reading case files." As he spoke, Leonard watched his guests' faces. They'd heard the story before, but they listened intently, drawing strength from each retelling. He described the crash of the door, the officer's shock at seeing his robe, the long fight that followed. "But the real heroes," he continued, "were all of you. Every person who came forward. every family who shared their story, every neighbor who stood watch when they tried to intimidate us. Through the window, the crowd outside had grown. Candlelight flickered across faces young and old, creating a gentle glow that pushed back the darkness. Someone had started singing softly, an old civil rights song about freedom and justice. "Look at that," Mrs. Alvarez whispered, moving to the window. "There must be hundreds out there." Indeed, the gathering stretched down the street. Leonard recognized faces from the courthouse, community meetings, and even some of the journalists who'd helped spread the story. They held their candles high, a constellation of light in the growing dusk. Tanya joined Mrs. Alvarez at the window. "They're not just here for you, Leonard. They're here because you showed them something important, that the system can work if we're brave enough to demand it." The singing outside grew stronger, more voices joining in harmony. The sound carried through the walls, filling Leonard's home with its message of hope and determination. He stood slowly, his eyes drawn to the judge's robe on the wall. In the candlelight, its simple black fabric seemed to hold all the weight and dignity of the law itself. But now, it represented something more. Not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but purpose. "You know," he said quietly, "when they first broke down that door, I thought they were trying to destroy something. My home, my dignity, my faith in justice." He turned to face his gathered friends. But they failed. Instead, they helped build something stronger. The room fell silent, waiting. They thought they could intimidate one judge, one neighborhood. Instead, they woke up an entire community. They showed us that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It's something we have to fight for together. Outside, more people were arriving with candles. The light grew stronger, pushing back the evening shadows. Leonard moved to the window, watching as neighbors greeted each other, shared stories, stood together in quiet solidarity. Mrs. Washington joined him, her voice soft but firm. "They thought they could break into your house and break your spirit. Instead, they helped us all find our strength." Leonard nodded, feeling the truth of her words. The room behind him was filled with friends and allies. The street outside glowed with candlelight and hope. His home, once violated, had become a symbol of resistance and renewal. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please like the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.